Hello friends, my name is JJ. So the other day I was watching a couple of videos from a very good up-and-coming YouTube channel called Parallel Pipes. One was called This Internet Iceberg Explained, and the other was called This YouTube Iceberg Explained. You guys are familiar with the whole iceberg meme, right? It basically depicts the idea that any realm of culture is divided between the easy mainstream stuff that everybody knows and the more obscure deep dive stuff known only to an expert few. A lot of times this meme is used to catalog things that get more horrifying the deeper you go, and that's definitely the case with these icebergs. Most of the stuff down here is pretty disturbing or repulsive, but it is also stuff that people actively enjoy seeking out for precisely this reason. As a result, my takeaway is that we are living through an interesting era in which the internet is birthing all sorts of fresh, horror-based entertainment for the young American middle class, based on the internet's unique skills at shocking the sensibilities of these sorts of people. So let's take a look at how it all works. So when we think of horror, it is useful to distinguish the kind of horror that preys on our animalistic fears of death and monsters and physical harm versus more psychological horror that exploits various anxieties of the mind. And while everybody on Earth shares the same basic fears of getting killed by a gorgon or an axe murderer, psychological horror is often a lot more culturally particular. When looking at the supposedly scariest things from these two icebergs, what struck me was how many of them had this very laser-like focus on the psyche of the modern American middle class. I mean, obviously there is a lot of universally horrifying stuff on the internet that just entails gross pictures of mutilated bodies or whatever. But there's also a lot of stuff that will only be horrifying to people from this specific part of the world, from a specific socioeconomic strata, holding certain specific cultural expectations about life. So as I explained in my award-winning video on middle class culture, the modern American middle class identity is in many ways far less about any objective quantity of wealth than enjoyment of a certain lifestyle, which is tightly associated with certain values, a huge one being order. The stereotypical middle-class person really values things like schedules and routines and familiar products and services. I mean, let's imagine the typical young American middle-class man. After he finishes work or school, he spends much of his life visiting the same websites, watching the same YouTube channels, and playing the same games from the same companies over and over and over. This stability of life offers a great opportunity for horror, since often all you have to do to create a disturbing moment is tweak one of these experiences in a slightly unexpected way. On both the internet iceberg and the YouTube iceberg, I would say that the majority of disturbing content documented was disturbing not because it evoked any fear of death or danger, but simply because it was disordered in some way. For example, one of the YouTube iceberg horrors was this video called Username 666, which is basically a story about a guy who tried to view a channel called 666, and when he eventually found it, it did not look like a normal YouTube channel at all. The infamous WebDriver Torso channel is another good one. This was a channel that made videos for years that were just noise and shapes in a way that was powerfully disconcerting just through its sheer abnormality. Its willingness to reject all established norms of what a YouTube channel is supposed to be like. Many of the internet horrors, likewise, consists of websites that are aggressively confusing and strange, like why, or OE Most of us have been socialized to believe that a website is a functional tool that serves some very practical purpose, you know, like shopping or reading a review or something. So when you encounter a website that has no self-evident purpose, it can be horrifying in quite a novel way. Our middle-class desire for everything to have some practical use makes us very preoccupied with solving the mystery of what is this for? Who made this? Why does this exist? This is also the case with the thriving realm of creepy found footage videos. The most iconic one to me is the Chinese guy eating the soup with the the Puppets. I'm sure you've seen it. You could say it has some old-fashioned creepiness, just in the austere set design and all that, but I think much more of the horror comes from the fact that we are told that this is a video that turned up on the internet without explanation. No behind-the-scenes making-of documentary or creator commentary or anything. In recent years, there has also been growing documentation of people encountering cryptic video games like Yumi Nikki or Sad Satan or 14/?? that are either extremely hard to find or aggressively unpleasant to play or have no way of being won. Such things shock our middle-class brains because they so aggressively reject all video game norms that we have grown up with, like that games have to be fun, popular, and seek the approval of their players. Now, it's not a coincidence that many objects of internet horror were deliberately created by artists, either as standalone projects or so-called ARGs, or altered reality games, which is becoming an increasingly catch-all term to describe any sort of interactive horror thing in the internet age. The artistic desire to subvert the realm of bourgeois predictability has been around for ages. Surrealist artists like Man Ray, Salvador Dali, or Merritt Oppenheim, for instance, enjoyed freaking out 20th century audiences with their sculptures of impossible domestic objects. It was part of what the Tate Museum called a desire to escape the rule of logic. Once movies were invented, in turn, we quickly got the phenomenon of the freaky experimental art film. You know, movies that consciously upend every middle-class expectation of what a movie is supposed to be in favor of like an 8-hour fixed shot of the Empire State Building doing nothing. Subversive musicians, for their part, have long experimented with making records that are just long tracks of noise in lieu of songs or singles. And even authors have played with books that do unnerving things with text and page layouts. Not all of this stuff is supposed to be horrific, per se, but it is supposed to be emotionally and intellectually challenging, at the very least. And what we are seeing now is the same sort of ethos carried into the realm of the internet, where instead of furry teacups, we are getting this. Along with unpredictability, another very stereotypical middle-class anxiety is fear of exclusion. This idea that there are a lot of important things that are being conspiratorially hidden from us. This stems from the traditional middle-class belief that knowledge is power, meaning that what we don't know might hurt us. I was actually a bit surprised in watching the Parallel Pipes videos just how often notions of secret websites and videos and things came up. You know, this idea that there's all these deep webs and dark webs and Mariana Trench webs out there that normies like you and me cannot access, and that these are the places where all of the weirdos from outside of respectable middle-class society congregate. It's usually either the lower classes conspiring to do crimes against us, or the upper classes conspiring to use their powers to screw us. We also tend to be disturbed by websites centering around people who have opted out of bourgeois society in some way, like the various 4chan style message boards, or this notorious website for virgins over 30 called Wizard Chan. Hives of weirdo miscreants of these sorts really play into our anxieties that the bonds holding the middle class together are actually quite fragile, and without constant efforts to keep their heads above the water, otherwise decent middle-class kids are in danger of falling in with these crowds. While it is true that there are a lot of really toxic internet communities out there that people should not hang out in, it also seems clear that some of our current cultural horror with grotesque internet subcultures is just an updated version of earlier middle-class fears over things like cults and suburban witches' covens and things like that. Groups that are plotting to convert our alienated young people into crazed or broken mutants who will be impossible to ever integrate back into mainstream bourgeois society. I think there's a similar sort of horrified revulsion directed towards internet people who are flamboyantly mentally ill, like the Time Cube guy or the recently arrested Chris Chan. This is of course a very heavy topic, but I do think that middle-class people are often uniquely frightened by neurodivergent people because their behavior is seen as very destabilizing to the sort of rigid, predictable life that they idolize. This then contributes to a very unhealthy stigma against the mentally ill that's at odds with the benign and manageable way that mental illness actually manifests most of the time. But the fear is they're just the same, and so it was probably always pretty inevitable that a handful of extreme cases of mentally ill people would emerge as figures of enormous fear and scorn in the internet age. The final major theme I've noticed in this nouveau genre of middle-class internet horror is a kind of old-fashioned one, namely haunted things. Middle-class people live lives defined in large part by their consumer possessions, and this closeness can be easily exploited by drumming up fears of our possessions turning against us. Again, this is a very old theme that has come up in all sorts of different horror media over the decades. What if our toys want to kill us? What if our food is secretly alien poison? What if our car is possessed by the devil? And so on. This topic of object betrayal comes up again and again in internet horror. There are endless so-called creepypasta short stories about haunted houses, or haunted video game cartridges, or haunted VHS tapes, or obviously haunted computers. Indeed, it is often implied that a lot of those creepily mysterious websites and games and things that we were talking about earlier weren't actually the creation of artists, but actual ghosts or demons. So I guess we can never really get fully away from the supernatural side of horror, after all. One thing I had never heard of before was this phenomenon where some corners of the internet push legends of despair codes, which is this idea that your emotional sanity or even life could be ruined simply by reading certain dangerous thoughts or strings of words or even memes that various internet psychopaths have discovered. Basically magic spells or curses, but we're calling them codes now because we're modern. These are all quite ludicrous. Like, one of the most famous ones is said to be the statement, solar plexus clown glider. But once again, we are seeing an exploitation of the traditional middle-class anxiety that we are all just hanging by a thread, and that something as basic as our very sanity could be destroyed in an instant by the things we are closest to, including our beloved internet. So if any of you guys are a fan of weird internet horror, I'd be curious to know about what sort of stuff you personally find the most unnerving and why. I'd be especially curious if you can link the stuff that you find the most compelling to one of these traditional middle-class anxieties that we've been talking about. Anyway, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next week.